Pleasure. This is our sixth Opportunity, it is our third board meeting outside of Washington, our sixth Opportunity 08 event. And at all of them, we've had panel discussions that have been a combination of Brookings scholars and local voices paying attention to the issues that the next president will face. And today's panel is similarly structured. We start with, I'm going to start introducing folks from my right, your left. And Glenn Hutchins said to me this is probably the first time he's been at the far right of any panel. Glenn Hutchins is the founder and managing partner of Silver Lake Capital and is a trustee of the Brookings Institution and has served on the White House staff. Bruce Katz, who's the vice president and director of our Metropolitan Studies program, and has just launched a blueprint for national prosperity, which we'll try to talk about a little bit here. Jeff Bader, who is, after 27 years in the government in a range of positions, from the State Department to the White House to the U.S. Trade Representative's office, is the director of the John Thornton Center on China at the Brookings Institution, and is time zone-wise somewhere over the mid-Pacific, having just flown back in from China yesterday. And Dana Beach, the executive director of the South Carolina Coastal Conservation League, and a partner of Bruce's and a longtime friend of the institution. So welcome to you all. I want to start with Glenn. And Glenn, your business and from your service in government has focused on global competitiveness, but there's so much going on. There's education, there's technology, innovation. What are the drivers? What's going on out there? What are the dynamics, as Steve Denning pointed to before, as you see them? What makes places competitive? What makes nations competitive?
Let's in 50 words or less.
Yeah.
Okay. So I spend my life in and around the information technology business, worried a lot about kind of innovation and productivity. And it's very clear to us who live in that world that the investments in R&D and the associated investments in research and the associated investments in development in information technology and the biotechnology related fields are driving a disproportionate share of global economic growth. The IT economy, for instance, is growing at about 2 to 3 times the rate of the rest of the economy, as a result of which is really the locomotive pulling economic growth in the world. When you go to, I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about China later, but when I go to China, I heard the governor here talking about the textile industry's moved to China. The people I talk to in China have no interest in the textile industry. They want to make semiconductors and software. They're focused on technology, not focused on the industries that they regard as the past. And essentially competitiveness, one way to think about it, is a battle for your national share of that growth, right? And we can come back to it a little later on, but I imagined as I was watching the debate last night imagine a sort of a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. Someone pulled out of one venue and put into another and observing this strange behavior. If you took sort of someone who thinks about competitiveness and productivity and watched that debate last night, there was almost nothing that was relevant to any of the issues that are vital to the future growth and productivity gains in our country and wealth creation. There was a study recently, so what is it, you asked? There was a study recently by the Information Technology Innovation Foundation called Digital Prosperity. I recommend people read it. And it essentially broke all this down. Essentially, in the long and complicated analysis, but identified 6 or 7 main things that happen when you as we've made significant IT investments and generated, by the way, from 79 to 2005, 63% increase in productivity in this country, which explains almost all of the wealth gains that we've had. You basically are investing in flexible supply chains. We can talk a little bit about this if you'd like. Generating new jobs, generating higher quality products and services, developing better decision-making tools, developing new research tools, and building larger and more efficient markets. The result of all that is that you end up, and think about the world we've experienced, you end up with less severe economic downturns. We've experienced in the last 25 years significant, you talk about peak to trough in terms of recessions. National Bureau of Economic Research has observed that our recessions have gotten less and less bad over the last 25 years as they were before that. Today, we're worried about a recession, but the technology economy continues to post significant very high single-digit gains in growth. There's a sort of a divide out there between the financial services economy, people worry about what the technology economy is doing. The technology economy result is continuing to grow to generate disproportionate share of gain, more jobs, When I was working in the White House, we were told, 1992 coming in, we were told that you couldn't have unemployment below 5%. That was essentially full employment, because beneath that you would generate massive inflation. Today we're very worried because unemployment has gone from 4.5 to 4.7%. The potential of the economy and the job creation potential of the economy is magnified significantly because of the lower inflation that's come from these productivity gains, massive productivity growth, and a terrifically innovative products and services. You have right now, many of us have on our belt more computing power than I think the U.S. Army had when I was in college, and we carry it around our belts these days. What that means is you sum all that up, and that's competitiveness. Higher per capita real incomes, higher per capita GDP. That's essentially kind of what's going on. Now the problems, so that's the good news, right? The bad news is kind of how we're competing. Maybe I'll make one other comment, which is that if you look at what's happened in the last 25 years, the other thing that was interesting about that debate is there was so much talk about the legacy of Ronald Reagan. That election occurred 28 years ago. It was at Apple and Microsoft had just been started. The microprocessor was just in this early stages of commercialization. I guarantee you Ronald Reagan did not have an email address. The notion that question of who had Ronald Reagan's legacy is kind of relevant to where we're going to take our country and where we have to take our country to compete. It's sort of kind of, it's a little bit antique in its flavor. But if you look back at what's happened over the last 25 years, we had the desktop PC revolution. The icons of that were probably Apple and Microsoft. That was followed very quickly by the networking revolution, where you built the internet out around the world. The icons of that are, let's call it Cisco and Google. And my personal belief, and Steve, I don't know what you think, others here who are involved in these things, but my personal belief is what's happening right now with, on the one hand, mobility and wireless, which is much, much bigger than the internet. There are far many units, many more units in people's hands, has much greater reach, it creates much greater productivity gains. It's a huge thing on the one hand, and the work that's being done at the intersection of biology, chemistry, medicine, and engineering have potential impacts that are far greater than what we've experienced in the last 25 years in kind of the PC and kind of internet and networking revolution. The question is, how do we compete for our share of this? There was I think it's every 3 years the OECD does a study. These are the developed countries of 15-year-olds and their facilities in math and science. The United States, our 15-year-olds rank 35th in math and 37th in science. And the average scores on a kind of comparable basis are meaningfully, statistically, significantly lower than those of the other OECD countries. Meaningfully, statistically, significantly lower. It's not just there are a whole bunch of people that we're tightly grouped with. We are low, and we are meaningfully lower. That's a very big thing. Our stock of engineers, we're not turning out anywhere near the stock of engineers that we have turned out, and scientists and computer scientists have turned out in the past. We're generating about 200,000 scientists, engineers, and computer scientists a year. India has passed us in that. China is now generating about 3 times as many as we are on an annual basis. The stock of scientists in our country is growing about 1% to 3% per year. Mexico, Brazil, East European countries, and Russia are all growing their engineering stock at 7% to 10% per year, about 3 to 4 times kind of our growth rates. So the human capital that we're developing to be competitive is falling increasingly behind. I was recently in a software development center in Shanghai, and I met a wonderful young lady, somewhere about 40 years old, who's a graduate of one of their computer sciences programs. She had spoke perfect English, and had outsourced a job. She was a $50,000 a year employee, outsourcing a $400,000 job a year job in the United States, not a $2,000 per year employee outsourcing a $25,000 job in the United States. The ability to take the rest of the world to take a share of our competitiveness as a result of developing the human capital necessary to compete is extraordinary. So I'll stop there. There are public policy issues about what we do about it. There's kind of the whole political thing about how do you observe what's going on in the political world today and what does that tell us. but perhaps we can get to that later on, if you'd like.
In fact, that's the plan. What I think I'd like to do is hear from each of the different perspectives what's going on, and then we can come back to what to do about it. So, Bruce, sort of, how does it break down nationally and locally? I mean, these are big, complicated issues. You've got technology, you've got the innovation that comes from the adaptation of that technology in the workforce. There are the human capital issues. But you can look at national numbers. But South Carolina isn't New York, isn't San Francisco, isn't Cleveland. How should we think about this?
Well, I think just to build on Glenn, I mean, if we went around the room and we all wrote down a little piece of paper, what really drives prosperity, what really matters to competitiveness in the United States or abroad, I think most of us would basically focus on the same things: innovation, human capital, infrastructure, and even the governor talked about the quality of place, which is a particular interest at Charleston. Well, those assets don't exist in the abstract. I mean, they're not evenly distributed across the landscape of this country or any other country. I mean, to some extent, we have a paradox now. We have Tom Friedman, obviously right, saying the world is flat. But in other respects, the world has become very, very spiky because all those assets, they congregate, they concentrate, they gather and strengthen in real places. The futurists predicted, 30 years ago, there'd be a sort of a mass deurbanization, in the United States and Europe. Actually, the opposite has occurred. The big places are getting bigger. So when we talk about national competitiveness, what we really are talking about is the aggregate of metropolitan competitiveness. The top 100 metros only sit on 12% of the American land mass. They have 2/3 of our population. They have 3/4 of our GDP. And more importantly, when you get to these assets like innovation, whether it's patents, whether it's venture capital funding, human capital, educational attainment, infrastructure, the rail, the port, the air hubs, and quality places, which is a little more intangible, but we obviously know it makes a big difference. These are the places, the metro areas, the top 100 metros, and Charleston's the 85th, are the ones that really concentrate these assets. And therefore, as we go forward, we have to be thinking regionally, state level, nationally, about how to leverage up these strengths. When you get to a place like Charleston, obviously, the challenges and the opportunities are not ubiquitous in the United States. The places start with distinctive clusters. They start with distinctive character. When I think about Charleston, I think about its competitive sort of challenge, I think really about three things. I think about the quality of this place, because Charleston has a brand. It's a little like Maine to some extent and some of New England, but there are very few places in the United States where the built environment is part of the competitive edge. And so Charleston's ability to compete going forward is very much to preserve what is special and distinctive about this place. And so much has been done to do that, but you never can stop. Because real estate markets, there can be distorting effects, there can be sort of a decentralization of people and jobs. So preserving the quality of this place is part of the competitive proposition. It's not a nice thing to do. It's absolutely critical to the future of this economy. The second piece is the port. This is a logistics hub. And that brings some enormous opportunities to connect globally to the world. But it also brings some enormous challenges in terms of how do you expand, how do you remain competitive, how do you deal with the congestion effects of being such a critical sea hub so it doesn't begin to undermine the quality of place. And the last piece, and this is not just Charleston, but I think it's something that we really have to talk about in terms of our competitiveness as a nation, is who will be the future workforce of this country. Right now, about 25% of our workforce are African Americans and Hispanics. In several decades, it will be upwards of 40%. Will that workforce be educated? Will they be skilled? Will they be able to participate in the global economy? Right now, 10 out of every 100 African Americans and Latinos who enter the 9th grade do not get a post-secondary degree. Well, that can't continue to happen if we're going to compete as a nation. So again, what used to be considered to be equity issues are now competitive issues. And I think Charleston and most other major metros in the United States, because they are the delivery agents on education. You know, the federal government may set standards, same with the states. At the end of the day, this is where the rubber hits the road. Educating the future workforce of the United States is really in the hands of Charleston and the other top 100 metros.
Jeff, Bruce talked about the world being spiky, not flat. And in his map of the world that shows the spikes, there are a lot of them in China. Charleston is, one of the biggest ports on the East Coast in the United States, but there are some pretty big ports in China as well, and they are as densely built as Charleston, but they're also more vertically built and literally. So give us a sense of what's going on in China. What has been driving this enormous growth, but also what are the challenges that people are feeling on the ground there?
Well, I think in terms of the success of China, so two words, it's openness and privatization. If you look at the Chinese understand very well what Governor Sanford was saying about the world being flat. I feel sort of like last night all we heard was everyone was running for the mantle of Ronald Reagan. Today I feel we're all running for the mantle of Tom Friedman. But this was the most closed economy in the world 25 years ago. I was involved in I completed the WTO negotiation on China's accession to the WTO, and they made the most generous, they accepted the most draconian opening of their market of any country that's ever joined the WTO. This is a country that was the number 30 trading country in the world 25 years ago. It's now number 3, and it's going to be number 1 soon. Investment going into China 15 years ago, about 15–20% of all investment that went to Asia went to China. Now it's about 70%. The investment comes not only from people like Phil, but even more from overseas Chinese. That was the genius of Deng Xiaoping, to understand that there were these Chinese all around Asia and the rest of the world who wanted to put money back into China. And that's what's been driving Chinese growth, $60 billion a year in foreign investment, more than any country in the world. And privatization. 20 years ago, the contribution of private enterprise to China's total GDP was approximately somewhere between 0 and 1%. Now, private and foreign direct investment is responsible for over 60% of China's GDP. So, I mean, those are the two obvious open secrets of China's growth. But these are not without enormous downsides. The challenges you mentioned are just huge. Chinese economy is massively unbalanced. There's too much investment. The investment rate of investment GDP ratio is something like 43–44%. That is orders of magnitude higher than the other Asian tigers were at their peak. And the result of that is that the investment is not rational. They have a financial services sector that does not rationally allocate capital. Interest rates are not an effective mechanism for determining allocation of capital. Basically, it's retained earnings by corporations. So particularly export-intensive, export-driven industries are the ones who are getting the capital, and they're continuing to grow. The savings to consumption ratio in China is the mirror image opposite of the U.S. Savings rate in China is between 40 and 50%. We're somewhere in the 0% range, give or take. Consumption, again, China has a shockingly low consumption rate. The reasons are obvious, because they have no social safety net. You have one child per family. You have basically no health care system or no social health care system, no social security system to speak of. When you get old, you're on your own. So naturally, you're going to save a lot. If you save a lot, you're not going to consume, and you're not going to import. And the result is that China is running about a $400 billion trade surplus with the world this year, about $250 billion with the U.S. The third factor I mentioned is energy. China is the businesses, the industries that are growing in China in the last few years, unfortunately, are enormously energy intensive. steel, aluminum, construction, cement. China, from 1980 to 2000, energy intensivity was declining. It's been going up the last few years. It's enormously energy inefficient. It takes about 8 times as much GDP per capita for each, about 8 times as much energy for each unit of GDP growth in China as it does in Japan. They're importing about 30% of the demand, of the increased demand in oil in the last 5 years as a result of Chinese growth. And that pattern is going to continue until at least 2030. They're very, very heavily coal-based economy. About 68% of all energy in China is coal-based. The global average is about 28%. If you think about global warming for a second, global warming is largely a factor of how much coal you produce. That's China. China either has passed us or is about to pass us in terms of emission of greenhouse gases. And that's not about to turn around. They're building about 1 or 2 coal-fired generators, power plants per week. Last point, just in terms of China's ability to compete. People are obviously very focused on China's competitiveness in labor-intensive industries, and that clearly is where their competitive advantage is now. They dominate in textiles, they dominate in footwear, they dominate in particularly in low-end electronics. They dominate in computers, which is the R&D is not Chinese. The R&D is from outside of China. The parts are brought into China where they're assembled. Actually, the biggest import item to the United States from China last year was computers and accessories. But that's not Chinese technology. But Chinese labor costs are about 5% of American labor costs, and that's pretty scary when you think about it until you think of the other half of it, which is Chinese productivity, which is also about 5% of American productivity. I think I'll stop there.
Dana, as Jeff was talking, the phrase, thinking about it in China's term, but it also I think applies to Charleston, the phrase that the governor used of sustainable competitive advantage. You know, there is a certain competitive advantage in China, clearly driven by low labor costs, but whether or not it's sustainable is also a question. But that question as much applies to Charleston. So give us some sense of that as you look at Charleston's landscape, whether it's the landscape or things like energy. How does this place think about those things, and does it have is that vision capable of being carried forward?
Well, I think sustainable is a fairly elusive term, but I think it helps to evaluate what we all agree is not sustainable to determine what sustainable might be. And virtually every economic consultant who's come through here in the last 10 years has noted, as the governor did and as Bruce has, that part of the asset that we have, the asset base of this economy, is the quality of life here. It's the environmental quality, it's the experience, the beauty of the historic city. But if we look at indices over the last 20 or 30 years, it does not look encouraging if we project those into the future. We have been very profligate in our use of land. We have, for example, over the 20-year period between 73 and 94, we were consuming land at 6 times the population growth rate. And for people who think in terms of acres versus numbers, we increased our urban footprint from about 45,000 acres to 160,000 acres of land. Population grew relatively much slower than that. So that is, I would say, an indication of a lack of sustainability in terms of land consumption and land use. Transportation is similar. Nationwide, vehicle miles traveled, driving is increasing at 2 to 3 times the rate of population growth. The reason for that is not people preferring to drive more. It's the construction of our cities, our metro areas that require people to take automobile trips for every trip they make. And it's true here too. We're seeing much longer commutes, more frequent driving and less ability to take other modes of transportation than we did even in the 70s and before that. Energy, South Carolina ranks 4th from the bottom in terms of energy efficiency. We are one of the largest consumers of electricity in the nation, and of course in world terms that puts us at the very top in the least efficient category. Though that's a fascinating statistic about China's consumption of energy compared to Japan. We probably fall closer to the side of China than we do on Japan in that regard. Human health is another one. I think when you hear the governor come back from China and talk about the problems that he saw there in terms of air pollution, and everybody who's been to China, I went 20 years ago and it was a problem then, and apparently it's dramatically worse now. We don't think as often, I think, that we have those same challenges, and yet every coastal river in South Carolina is contaminated with mercury that creates fish consumption advisories and public health risks for people who consume fish from those rivers. We also are on the verge of approving a new port terminal. As Bruce noted, absolutely an integral part of our economy. But this terminal, because of the lack of support and infrastructure investment at the local, state, and federal level, will cause I-26 to reach gridlock. It will also cause our air quality to exceed federal standards in terms of particulate matter, which is a particularly dangerous pollutant. So I think we could all agree, looking at those indices, that we have problems. We are not on a path toward sustainability. We are on a path away from sustainability in Charleston. Some things have improved. We have done a wonderful job in the region of beginning to preserve landscapes that are important, historic and ecological landscapes. We've got a great collaboration among the private and public sector in that regard. I don't think I'm being too provincial in saying that we probably even are one of the leaders in the nation in terms of protecting land and using land protection as a region-shaping mechanism, which is a very, I think, sophisticated approach to land use. But we've got a lot to do, and part of the problem, as Brookings has so well pointed out, is the dysfunction at the federal level of the delivery systems for funding for transportation and housing and other infrastructure, and the obstacles that the federal system places in front of us as a region. It allows us to exhibit the worst form of behavior, very politically motivated behavior and not big thinking, and it really prevents us from doing the kinds of things that we heard Mayor Riley so eloquently explain that he had done in downtown Charleston over the last 32 years. He gave a great talk, and everybody who's heard him, and most people here probably have heard him, know how inspiring his talk is. But it's notable in the sense that everything he did that was significant was done in spite of existing systems and existing federal delivery systems and existing state and local regulations and conventional views of how housing and transportation should be done. So we've got a long way to go, and the federal role is key here.
Why don't we do a quick set of questions about what to do next, bridging off that, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And I want to come back to Glenn. Glenn, we've now heard this landscape of how things apply fairly locally, and the kinds of things that you indicated, from science and math to what makes innovation and technology work and lead to productivity. You know, if you had to think about a top lever for competitiveness, where do you go? What is the thing that say the federal government can and should do to think about it? Is it education? Is it providing incentives for companies to invest in innovation? Or is it a diverse portfolio? What do you do?
That's another sort of tough question, but the answer is there's no simple solution. I mean, we've done a terrific job in this country. We've been the leader in new technologies since the Industrial Revolution. If you think about it, and each wave of technology investment has driven productivity growth and incomes. But What I would refer you to in that regard is there was a study done by called Rising Above the Gathering Storm. I don't know if people are familiar with this, but it was a study that was done by the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the Institute of Medicine, all scientists thinking about what we need to do for a future. And they focus on, it's a series of, here's the best way to think about it, which is any big complex problem you have to take on does not have a magic bullet solution, can't be reduced to a bumper sticker or a sound bite in a debate. It just doesn't happen, right? And so the key recommendations of this panel involve, I think, 3 or 4 main areas. One is K through 12 science and math education. We really have to invest in that. That takes 20 to 25 years to have a real important impact to our economy, but it's absolutely central. Science and engineering research, funding for basic research. And one of the major things, we'll go into some of the public policy and political issues here, is I'm involved helping Harvard think about investing in its sciences for the future. All of the major research institutions in this country are expecting meaningful declines, not just in growth, but absolute dollars potentially in research funding from the government, largely as a result of the fiscal profligacy that's occurred over the last 7 or 8 years. We just aren't going to have the money to invest in research, and research is one of the places where as we get to some degree of fiscal sanity is going to have to come out of. So we're seeing significant declines in investments in research, just basic research isn't we need it. Federal research grants, so science and engineering research is what they focus on, science and engineering education. Interestingly enough, in the context of science and engineering education, there were 6 major recommendations, 3 of which involved visas, 3 of which involved immigration, right? And the only thing we hear about with respect to immigration on the campaign trail is that it's a bad thing, and we have to keep immigrants out of this country. We've got to seal our borders, and in fact, we've had terrific long-term benefits over time by reverse brain drain in the United States, bringing the best scientists to this country, training them here, retaining them here, and using them to help grow productivity in our country. And then with respect to economic and technology policy, there's a bunch of things you can do about intellectual policy protection, stronger R&D, tax credits, et cetera. So that's a whole bunch of series of policy things you can do. The other thing you need to do is leadership. I mean, one thing that's interesting is it's passed completely without note that I know of, but I think it was around World War II, FDR administration, I might be wrong, we created a presidential science advisor. Person in the White House is responsible for science and technology. This is the first administration in which that person, since it was created 50 or 60 years ago, does not report to the president. Right? The president of the United States does not have somebody directly reporting to him who thinks about it, responsible for science and technology policy. In fact, I think that job might be 2 levels below the president now. It's the first time that's ever happened. The people who have been making policy, I think the tone starts at the top of my point. The people who have been making policy in our country, around our economy, not a single one of them, except with respect, I think, not fair to say now, I think a Treasury Secretary comes from an institution, Goldman Sachs, that's had a lot of involvement in funding the technology economy. But before that, these were people who came from the basic metals industry, the railroad industry. We used to joke that maybe the next Treasury Secretary is going to be a blacksmith. The people who have run the Commerce Department have come from the oil industry and the cereal industry. They're the people who made policy and said there's almost nobody who you can go to in a serious senior policy-making position around the economy. This administration spent their life in the innovative science and technology-based part of the economy. So I think it involves leadership and the point of view that they have and the experiences they bring and the orientation they have, and it involves a series of policy matters.
Bruce, as I think about these issues locally, I was struck both in your presentation yesterday and in a conversation that I had the other day with the chairman of the College of Charleston, which is how difficult the challenge it is, and when the governor was speaking, how difficult the challenge it must be for a governor in the name of competitiveness to invest in education where the payoffs aren't, particularly primary early education, where the payoffs aren't going to be 15 or 20 years. How do you get at that challenge if you're a governor? You want or a mayor, you want short-term competitiveness gains, but the investments are so long-term.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets to some of what Glenn is talking about. And this is particularly true at the federal level, less true at the state and the local level, is the leadership vacuum. I mean, I think, the public, I mean, we had, Tom and Ken up here before. The public is so hungry for leadership. And they understand that there are things that we need to do now to prepare for the long haul. Some of that is to develop, in the research and development, to prepare the sort of next generation of innovative products, innovative cures, and so forth. Some of it is about the hard work of educating the next generation of workers. Some of it is about making the infrastructure investments so that we have a first-class infrastructure in a first-class economy as opposed to what we have now. So it's about leadership, it's about vision, it's about setting that, both at the national level and at the state level, evidence-based, sort of outcome and goal-oriented. And then it's about holding government accountable. I think the biggest challenge the next administration is going to face, whoever gets elected, Republican or Democrat, and whatever the Congress looks like, is that the federal government is essentially broken now. It is a legacy government, in my view. It's a collection of essentially ossified agencies, compartmentalized agencies, with a lot of bad habits that have occurred and accrued over many, many decades. And it needs to be fundamentally reinvented. We talk about reinvention in the 1990s. We didn't really do it. And so, whether you're the president, key congressional leaders, or a governor, we have sort of denigrated the public sector in this country for decades, even though the public sector is critical to deliver certain goods and services that are critical to our national competitiveness and obviously critical to our national security. So this is about setting visions that the public can basically buy into, that are evidence-based and fact-driven, but then also getting back to the business of governing. And that is very much, in my view, about setting goals and holding ourselves accountable. Transportation, infrastructure is fundamentally critical to this region going forward because of the port, because of your geography, your location. Well, federal transportation policy at the national level at this point is an unaccountable free-for-all. There is no strategic vision like Dwight Eisenhower had back in the 50s with the interstate. We've lost any sense of common purpose. So we need to, again, whether it's the governor, whether it's the president, bring back that sense of vision, but then basically govern again. And that is easy to say, hard to do, but I can point to several states in this country and many cities that are doing this well, and they are basically the laboratories to sort of bubble up of the good practices and good ideas.
Jeff, one thing that we hear, the public may be looking for leadership, but they're also sort of scared of change, particularly driven by abroad. And one of the responses to that you hear is sort of time out on trade. And I'm sure people in China might get nervous when they hear that and see that. One of the things that you pointed to is the sort of cheap and dirty energy in China as, in addition to cheap labor, driving things. So as the Chinese hear, on the one hand, time out on trade, on the other hand, we might act on global warming, but only if you do. What's the reaction likely to be? Are they just going to sort of go off and do their own thing and say you're out of touch, or do they start to recognize these challenges themselves? Or are they willing to have a conversation with us about it? What does that look and feel like?
Bill, let me answer that, but something Bruce said, I just feel I have to. It prompted a thought in my mind. I just want to expand on something Bruce said. Bruce talked about Washington being broken and the irrelevance that communities feel about Washington. A few weeks ago, I had dinner with a friend who's a Republican governor of a western state. I was struck. Governor Sanford mentioned that he's open, or maybe John mentioned that Governor Sanford has opened an office in China. This governor told me that he and his people regard Washington, the executive and legislative branches, as so irrelevant/destructive to the issues that they're concerned about that he has closed his Washington office. So,
did he open one in China?
He had just come back from China.
Yeah, exactly, right.
Okay, anyway, so I anyway, sorry, Bruce, but that really struck me. Global warming. The Chinese, of course, have resisted the notion that they should accept compulsory caps on emissions. Their attitude is, first of all, we're only producing about 1/4 or 1/5 as much carbon dioxide emission as you in the United States are. Next of all, our GDP per capita is somewhere around $1,700, and you're around, I don't know, we're around close to 40,000. We can't afford that. They have the Indians backing them up in that position. That's a pretty powerful block of 2.5 billion people that don't want to accept mandatory caps on global emissions. But the political reality here is it's inconceivable that we can have some sort of a global climate change regime going forward that doesn't, in some fashion, capture China and India. The Chinese kind of have gotten, I would say, half religion on the subject. Their National Development and Reform Commission has come out with a report on global warming, which accepts that it's a reality and accepts that human activity is a principal cause of it. It's a pretty good study. It's something I saw about 6 months ago. It's something that would not have come out in China a year and a half ago when they were in denial.
Might not have come out from our government a year and a half ago.
They more or less coincided. But you go through this 50 pages of analysis of all the horrible impacts that global warming is going to have on China, and they have them in spades. And then at the end it says, what are we going to do about it? It's got about 4 lines that says basically we're going to keep developing, and we're going to have our own environmental policy that protects our people in the same fashion we have for the last 15 to 20 years. Thank you very much. Goodbye, exclamation point. I know a fair number of people, including some Brookings scholars, who are now trying to develop working relationships with Chinese counterparts on the global warming issue on the assumption that come 2009 we're going to have a president who is going to take the issue much more seriously than this administration has, and that it is a major potential source of friction and tension between our two countries. And I think the Chinese understand this intellectually, but they don't know quite how to get from an intellectual understanding to policy implementation. I mean, more generally, the Chinese have a great gap between stated intentions on economic policy and implementation. I was just mentioning this overinvestment problems, export-driven growth. China doesn't have much of an R&D sector. All of these things are things that Chinese leaders understand well and are national priorities, which they highlight in their functional equivalents of the State of the Union message, but nothing happens because they don't have the tools to implement. So that's where we are.
Dan, and as a place like this continues to develop, you touched on the energy issues before, 4th lowest efficient state in the country. Is there a sense of purpose here, or are people focused on it? Give us Washington invaders here a sense of what's going on locally about these issues. And then we'll open it up to questions.
I think energy is the one arena that there is some reason for optimism about the public discussion. I don't recall any issue that has been as fully debated and enthusiastically debated in this state as energy is now being debated. The governor formed a climate commission, and it consists of 31 members, and there are working groups that bring another 50 or so people in. And the goal is to develop a state climate plan by July. The city of Charleston has got a committee working on climate and energy efficiency. And so there's a very, I think we're at a moment in time where we can really, if we do this right and we do it intelligently, we can make an enormous impact. But the challenge, I think, is doing it superficially. It's very easy to do it superficially. You know, you have public meetings and you have a plan, and the plan sits and is only partially implemented. Energy, it seems to me, is the one issue around which we can organize a renaissance for our national economy and for our local economies too. I think that's the beauty of it. It's not, there's no silver bullet. I think Glenn mentioned there's no one thing we can do, but to use maybe a Mark Sanford style rural analogy, this is sort of the silver birdshot of the economic arena. Energy, if we do it right, and it comes down, I think, more than anything to how we finance it, how we finance efficiency and conservation, has the potential to deploy hundreds of billions of dollars which will go back into the economy that are now being lost to basically to the atmosphere and creating the resulting risk that we face, especially in this city with global warming, when much of the city is between 7 and 10 feet above mean sea level. Energy efficiency and conservation has a unique ability to harness market forces to reinvigorate key sectors of the economy, including the financial sectors, construction, manufacturing, and to employ people in this country, because so much of the efficiency agenda cannot be outsourced. Although there are substantial international benefits from it, we have to do efficiency on the ground here. And I think that if we can get the financing right, figure out how to scale it up, rather than have it sort of dribble out in bits and pieces here and there, which it will unless we really focus on it intently, we could, it's the one issue, it's the one economic opportunity that has the unique ability to reinvigorate the economy with essentially none of the negative externalities of social and environmental costs that are associated with our conventional construction of economic activity. But it needs a federal involvement. A federal role is key in it. It's not large, but it's key. This is mostly a private sector, private market initiative.
And there's a lot of complementarity between the way you talk and the way Bruce talks about that federal-local partnership. I want to open it up now to questions. I know there's a whole lot of people, both locally and from the Brookings Group, that play on these issues, and really welcome your questions. And please let us know who you are. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. My name is Neil Whitman, and I thank you so much for putting this on today. This is fascinating. Really, I have two questions in there. I would just focus one on political. For you, Jeff, in China, you're talking about what's happening there economically is amazing. I would assume that there is a growth of the middle class there, and I'm wondering where is the collision between a middle class that is gaining some economic freedom within the confines of a political system that clearly does not allow that. And Jeff, the opposite, we've got this great political freedom in our country and we're broken. In your opinion, what is it going to take to get us moving? Obviously, we've got an election. There is gridlock in Washington now. You've made it very clear it's broken. Is there hope? Thank you.
I'll take the China question, and
Okay.
I'll leave the U.S. question for others. That is, as we used to say, the $64,000 question for China. The middle class by 2020 is probably going to be somewhere in the 400 million range. That still leaves another billion people, but and they're mostly along the coast in Shanghai, Tianjin, Dalian, Beijing, Guangzhou. They at this point, are comfortable with the system. They are beneficiaries of the system. When you have a system that's an economy that's growing 11% a year, that's not tinder for a revolution or for a dramatic change in the system. But I think the general pattern of history, particularly throughout Asia, is that as countries develop middle classes, they expect to participate in the way their society functions, and they will not forever accept simply a passive role with a self-chosen elite. I take that as a given. I think that the main demographic fact that's going to bring about the change that you're implicitly alluding to is migration in China. You look right now, China's about 2/3 rural, about 1/3 urban. By 2030, that figure is going to be reversed. There are about 10 to 13 million people per year moving from the countryside to the cities in China. And as people urbanize and join the middle class, their expectations are going to change. But how this is going to happen, when this is going to happen, it's impossible to predict, as Tom and Ken trying to predict what's going to happen 3 weeks from now in the elections. I just take it as inevitable that we will see within a generation, I guess I won't use the word democracy, but I'll use the word a system that is more participatory, more transparent, and more accountable than what we have now in China.
Bruce, do you want to address the American political system is broken question?
Yeah, I think and we may want to separate out why the federal level is broken, because I think it's several different things. I personally don't think American governance is broken, because I think what has happened in the past 30 years is we push responsibilities down to the state and local level, that there has been a response. That's where the innovation is, that's where the energy is, that's where people are grappling with the challenges of globalization, the challenges of sustainability. It's the federal level that's broken. And I think, so there's several aspects to this. One is the intense partisanship. And I think, clearly that is being discussed in this presidential debate on both sides of the aisle, of who is going to be the true unifier and who is going to try to sort of heal the divide. The second aspect is what I think is sort of a broken circuitry, where you've got all this innovation happening, at the local and the metropolitan level, to some extent at the state level. It's not sort of bubbling up. And I think what has to happen with that, and this is very much about what our initiative at Brookings is about, is we do need for corporate, civic, and political leaders at the metro level to organize themselves both within metros and across metros to basically take back the federal government. I mean, to basically, instead of allow, for the kind of earmarking and horse trading, the sort of very, non-evidence-based policy making to occur in Washington, to have the metropolitan level collaborations begin to guide and ultimately dictate how the national government operates. We have not seen that in the United States. It is sort of every tub on its own bottom. Every metro basically deals with its own congressional delegation. Every metro tries to negotiate its way through the federal labyrinth. I do think there is a possibility for a very different kind of partnership between the federal level, the states, and the metros. But it's going to require for these metropolitan innovative partnerships to relate very differently with the federal government, be more assertive, be more focused on structural and systemic change at the national level, as opposed to just that one particular piece of the pie. The last piece why the federal government is broken is the lack of accountability. And this is one of the peculiar aspects of devolution, where basically the federal government began to sort of push responsibilities out, sort of block granting of large aspects of domestic programs and policies. But for the most part, with a few exceptions like welfare, there was never any performance of state and local actors and private sector conduits. And I think, at a time when we've got to deal with these major competitive issues, whether it's around innovation, whether it's around human capital, whether it's around sustainability, we do need an adult, to some extent at the national level, basically connecting performance to resources. So when we send out hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure funding, it's not, there shouldn't be an attitude in Washington, which it is now, hey, let's just see what happens. Even worse, let's earmark a large portion of this without any sort of reference to true competitive and sustainable goals. I think we can get back to a point where the federal government is playing a leadership role, but in a nuanced way. I mean, we're not Britain, we're not France, we're never going to operate from the center, but we do need a national government that can, basically lead and empower and hold states and localities accountable. I mean, there is a recipe for this that we can perfect in the next administration.
Glenn?
That's very well said. I would just add two other things, very broad. I mean, it's a very big question, right? But two broad things. One is if you're going to make the investments we've talked about, and you've mentioned infrastructure a couple times, and so have you, I think it's terribly important, we're going to have to get our fiscal house in order because we can't afford today to spend anything on anything important, right? And so the Republicans and the Democrats are going to have to go back to Andrews Air Force Base. They're going to have to do a deal. They're going to have to get revenue. They're going to have to cut spending. They're going to have to create a glide path to get the deficit down. And then we're going to have to be able to get the resources together to make the kind of investments we have. We can't do that we can't afford to make the investments necessary to do it. That's kind of one thing. There's a big fiscal mess that has to be solved, right? 1, 2, we have to create a stake on the part of the middle class, defined very broadly in kind of what's going on in terms of our economic growth. There's a very interesting project that many of us here are part of at Brookings called the Hamilton Project. Go to the Brookings website. You can find a lot of the materials and thought process about this. But essentially what we have to do is to create the means by which the people in the middle to lower socioeconomic strata get their fair share of the economic growth we generate. A whole bunch of issues around that, but it has to do with healthcare reform, pension reform, investments in education that we've talked about, changes in the way we manage our social insurance programs. There's a whole bunch of ways in which we have to just think very differently about what government does for people. This was what Tom Donald, I think, said in one of the conversations that he's had. Tom and Ken are really very interesting to listen to, that he described Barack Obama as the first post-partisan candidate. It's very interesting, and then there could be some of the genius of his campaign could be in the notion that some of these debates we've had in the past are kind of irrelevant. We have to start thinking about how we solve these problems together. This election is going to, I think, say a lot about what the kind of Americans want in terms of how we conceive of these problems together and solve together, or if we fall back in the same kind of partisan differences and gridlock and issues that you've lamented. So.
Speak up just a little bit, or maybe turn the mic.
I'm a professor in the School of Economics and Management at Tsinghua University. I'm visiting at the Kennedy School at Harvard. I think that I want to pick up the scene.
And a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution.
I want to pick up this scene on opportunity. I think that people talk about this 2008 election as an opportunity for some new thinking. And I think also maybe this is also a place, a time to think about globalization in a sort of new paradigm. I think now when we talk about globalization now, we talk about India and China, and then we talk about the competitiveness in a sort of negative, sense. But how about the new opportunities that globalization might bring to the U.S., to the U.S. economy? And I think after spending about a day and a half in Charleston here, I can see there are so many opportunities, to link up what's happening here to what's happening in China. And the mayor, I think in terms of trade, maybe we should try to input people like Mayor China, because China is very, very fast, and many of the traditions, many of the old buildings were torn down and so on. So we need somebody like him to really get to the to talk to the mayors in China to see the value of preserving those traditions. And so I think there are tremendous opportunities to exchange of Charleston and other cities in China, and also in terms of tourism. Now many tourists now coming to the U.S. They typically go to the New York, Washington D.C. and so on. But increasingly, many of these tourists, they want to see something different. And I can see Charleston is a perfect place. And so there are many of those sorts of things, complementary things that people can think about. And also I think there are some common issues that actually U.S. and China are facing, like the climate change and so on. So how about U.S. and China work together to think about ways how can we tackle the climate change issues? How can we actually deal with the coal as a major source of energy? I mean, U.S. also is very much coal-based energy reserves. So I think how about we think about some new opportunities that we can actually work together. Thank you.
Jeff?
Yeah, just a brief word on that. I think one thing that we can do on that, Shuilan, is the whole issue of, it's a new issue for us, is Chinese investment. Chinese now have upwards of $1 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. That's all happened in the last 5 years. 5 years ago, it was all U.S. Outward investments around the world, and when we were negotiating investment treaties, we were concerned about protection for U.S. investment. Now it's becoming here. And the question is, what kind of an attitude are we going to take towards that? Chinese have created a sovereign wealth fund, and it's capitalized with about $200 billion. it's not the only one. The United Arab Emirates, the Russians, the Saudis. We're looking at a number of them. And the question is, what is our attitude going to be going forward towards inward investments? And I think historically, if you go back to the 80s with the flood of Japanese investments in the U.S., there was much hue and cry in Washington and the Congress about it, about how they're taking over. But if you went to localities, people were enthusiastic. If you went down to Kentucky and Tennessee, where the Japanese were looking to invest, come on in. And I have a hunch we're going to see the same kind of phenomenon with regard to Chinese investment. The question is Washington going to get in the way, or is Washington going to facilitate?
Glenn, I was, as Shuilan was talking, I was thinking about some of the statistics that both you were talking about and you showed me in some slides earlier. To the extent, and when you were particularly talking about computers actually being manufactured and put together in China, but the technology and perhaps some of the component parts are made elsewhere, do you see a lot of actual mind melding in the technology world between people in different countries, or is it essentially segmented and simply sent across the high-speed lines? What do you see in terms of technological, not just adaptation, but collaboration and communication?
It was interesting. I heard Tom Friedman talk a couple years ago about his book, The World is Flat. And he starts his presentation off by saying, well, I was out covering post-2001 Afghanistan and Iraq, the world changed. And that's a good way of thinking about it, because while he was covering Afghanistan and Iraq, the technology people were changing the world. In other words, what he understood, it was what we did every day. So it wasn't sort of particularly insightful to us, because it's kind of what we were doing, right? So the notion that the world is flat, that there's a national global broadband infrastructure that allows intellectual property to be developed all over the world, I mean, that's all just now kind of a routine part of what you do. Your intellectual property supply chains are as flexible and as global as your physical asset supply chains. And you will develop that technology wherever the talent is to develop the technology, the people be organized to do it. So there really is very, very little difference today, increasingly, between the technology talent that resides in the major centers around the world. And so, and that's kind of point one. Point two is the half-life of this thing moves so rapidly that the half-life of technological innovation these days is about 2 years. Right, so people talk a lot about the PC supply chain being sort of in China, and Lenovo bought IBM, and all the things we're talking about there. But the PC supply chain is really kind of yesterday's news in terms of technology. That's been optimized. The technology around it is being improved incrementally, but very little innovation is happening in that space right now. All the innovation is happening today, not all of it, but that's the overstatement. The predominant amount of innovation in the IT community is happening in wireless and mobility. The amount of units that people have in their hands is a vast multiple amount of units they have on their desktop. That's where the semiconductor, the software, the content, all of that is happening. And I think many people know that the Europeans have long been more advanced than we in the United States have been in that. A lot of that's happening outside the United States. The Chinese are building the Chinese are adding, I think, an RBOC a month, the equivalent of a regional Bell operating company in the United States. They're building that a month, and they're enforcing their own standards and imposing their own technology. So then the technology increasingly coming out of that parts of the world. So you can feel it kind of slipping away as you already. And so it's a very good thing in one sense, because what people lose track of is the fact that these goods that we are provided, the services, the associated technology, is a very, very significant improvement in our lifestyles, because we get a lot more for a lot less, kind of every day. But the rapidity of the change means that the ability of it to migrate where it can be made in the most efficient manner by the cleverest people who are working the hardest is virtually instantaneous.
Alan?
I wanted to make a comment and perhaps a suggestion about an important element of infrastructure, and that is energy. and specifically, the context for this comment is specifically electric power. There are a number of scientists, one in particular from MIT, who has calculated using fairly conservative assumptions that if you look at worldwide power requirements, electric power requirements, between now and the year 2050, there's no way to get there with existing technologies, hydroelectric, nuclear, coal, what have you. This individual's particular interest is in solar power, particularly photosynthesis. And of course, that doesn't exist, but solar power exists, but that methodology doesn't exist. There are technologies, and I use that word technologies, that are available for energy production, the most important of which, certainly for our country as well as many other countries, is nuclear. And I think the nexus between the problems that Glenn is describing, namely the retarded rate at which we are promoting science and science capability, as well as the needs for infrastructure that Bruce is articulating, and the terrible shape our government capabilities are to deal with this. And I want to suggest, and perhaps invite a comment, that there is a human element here that I have yet to hear, and that is a sense of confidence in science. Because of our ill-preparedness and our understanding of scientific advances, we are ill-prepared to place confidence in scientific answers, most specifically, Yucca Mountain. The gating problem in nuclear power is the storage of waste. We have a scientific answer, but the population, particularly the population in Nevada, right, doesn't understand it in a way that is internalized to where they have the confidence to allow it to go forward. So it seems to me that in addition to the particular aspects of federal regulation, particular aspects of scientific advances, okay, we have to deal with the confidence of our population in those advances so they can make informed public policy decisions. So I invite a comment on that. Or
Dana, Bruce? Dana, why don't you give us a local take on how people approach energy in general, the adaptation of technology, and then nuclear in particular. Are there local nuclear plants? How do people see that locally, but also in the broader context of waste and storage?
South Carolina is a heavily nuclear state. We get about 60% of our energy from nuclear, which is considerably above the national average. We also are we bear the burden of nuclear from the nation because the Savannah River site is the de facto storage site and potentially permanent storage site if something doesn't change for nuclear waste, not only in this country, but increasingly from other countries. Italy recently proposed shipping nuclear waste through the port of Charleston to be stored at Savannah Riverside. Governor Dick Riley some years ago in the early 70s or late 70s, I guess, said the first law of nuclear waste is it stays where it's put. And we have certainly seen that play out in South Carolina. And I would just say as a maybe gratuitous remark as a South Carolinian, that the argument that Yucca Mountain isn't safe because they can't guarantee 100,000 years of safety is somewhat of a ludicrous assertion when we are looking at an unconsolidated geology that is currently already contaminated by nuclear and hazardous waste on the banks of the Savannah River. So we don't have too much sympathy with 100,000 years of safety. I do think that your point is right. I think the issue of how much we are willing to put our commitment into science, maybe not so much faith or trust, but there's a certain amount of that, but I think commitment is important too. I would say, though, that in terms of the 2050 time horizon, whether we're able to meet that, I am absolutely certain that what you said is true, that we can't ramp up our energy production to reach the trajectory that we predict now. But The U.S. now is half as efficient as Europe, roughly, and in the U.S., on average, uses twice as much energy per capita as California does. California has faced some serious challenges with energy, and in one year when they had the brownout, they were able to reduce, through demand-side management, reduce consumption or demand, peak demand, by 26%. So that's a phenomenal result that can be replicated nationwide if we have the will and the commitment to do that. Now, whether it takes a crisis, which we will face, or whether it will be forward thinking on the part of the states and the federal government is probably the question. And we certainly hope it will be the latter. There's no reason in the world that it should not be, because of all the reasons that you all know and that I mentioned, the benefits of being more intelligent in our use of energy, working on demand-side management, efficiency, and conservation. It's a national security issue. It is an environmental issue. It's an employment issue. It's an economic development issue. It is a social issue because the people who are most desperately harmed by inefficiency are people who are in poor households. They are in households that are, in most cases, the least efficient, and they also spend the largest percentage of their income on energy. So I think the technology side is key, and we need to apply that equally to the conservation and efficiency agenda that we do in new production.
Glenn is the source of the Doonesbury cartoon strips that were circulated at everybody's tables, and I know he has a thought or two about Americans' approach and view of science and technology. Do you want to talk a minute or two on that, Glenn?
I think we've gotten most things I want to talk about. I thought when I found that, I was trying to imagine what it would be like, and I tried to do a little bit of this game playing last night, what it would be like for a scientist to observe the debates and kind of the political process in Washington and what the sort of that disconnect would be. And this is a cartoon that's gone around the sort of the technology and science industries pretty rapidly, which gets at the disconnect between sort of what we're debating about with respect to our national priorities and kind of what the scientists see as the reality in the world, or medicine, in this case a doctor sees the reality in the world in which he lives and how they clash. So it's just
I don't mean this as a partisan comment, but Obama, indicated when he said, what's the most important thing a president can do? He indicated, change the way people think about themselves, the way the American people think about themselves. And that's really a subset of what Alan was indicating a minute ago about science and technology. And to me, the most alarming aspect of whether it's last night's debate where we were going 30 years back when we were talking about Reagan, and then the very refreshing conversation we had this morning with the governor of South Carolina, who was really talking about globalization and talking about today's issues. But when you think about it, the real problem is we're not talking about tomorrow's issues. And some of the transformation that China will have to go through, India will have to go through, this country needs to go through. We need to elevate the dialogue, the debate, the discussion, the deliberations. And that's really challenged Brookings to think about how we do that. How we start getting the debate that was, the discussion we've had somewhat this morning, but was absolutely devoid of any content in that area last night. We had the majority of the candidates last night basically indicating the jobs were coming back. We all know for an absolute fact the jobs aren't coming back. There is a different type of job in which America has a huge competitive advantage. We are on the cusp of transitioning from an industrial economy to a knowledge-based economy. There is no better country in the world. If I'm China, and I'm trying to figure out how do I compete with the United States, we have enormous comparative advantages that we can capitalize upon. But we can't do it without leadership. And to me, the closest thing we have to a silver bullet is leadership. And that's what we are absolutely devoid of, I think, currently, and frankly, with a lot of the candidates. And so, I challenge Brookings to think about how we think about, getting the dialogue and the debate on the real issues.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Let me start here because this gentleman's hand's been up for a while, and then maybe Bell Sawhill. Why don't we take two questions at one time, and we'll go for final comments from people.
Thank you. My name is Hamilton Davis. I work down here in Charleston for the conservation. When we talk about the economy and economic growth on a local, national, or global level, we have to take into consideration that all these economies are dependent on finite resources, which provide the foundation, provide their foundation. Climate change, obviously, the discussion has been elevated, but when you look at the problems with water quality, water availability, the deterioration of soil conditions in our agricultural lands, the poor health of our oceans, and the rapid loss of biodiversity, these are issues directly tied to the world's economic prosperity, but they're primarily discussed by environmentalists and scientists. They're not being discussed by our politicians. They're not being discussed by our economists. How do we bring the environment into this discussion in more than just an aesthetic, tangential way?
Bill?
I think I was inspired by Steve to talk a little bit more about the issues that aren't getting enough attention. And Glenn, you mentioned the fiscal mess, and I just want to remind all of us that we've got a serious problem of needing to reallocate federal resources if we're going to do any of the things that all of you are correctly talking about. Bear in mind that only about 18% of the entire federal budget is allocated to the kinds of issues that you've all been discussing. The rest is interest on the debt, defense, and entitlements, particularly Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. None of the politicians, particularly the Democratic politicians, are being honest about the need to either raise taxes to levels that we've never experienced in this country. I'm talking about 50% higher than anything we've ever paid before, or to completely restructure those entitlement programs. If we don't do one or the other, we are simply going to crowd out spending on science, on research, on education, on energy, on the environment. And that's what's likely to happen unless we have the leadership to change that. That's not being discussed at all right now. To mention a little bit about what Brookings is trying to do on this front, I think the Hamilton Project is doing a great job in getting the word out about some of these terrific trade-offs that we face and the need for more leadership. As part of my own work as the Budgeting for National Priorities Project, we've now been to 30 cities, talked to groups like the group in this room about the fiscal challenges facing the country, and we get tremendous responsiveness from local leaders. They understand the issue after you explain it to them, and they're willing to see entitlements reformed, and they're willing even to see taxes increase, particularly if it could be in the context of a fundamental tax reform. But I really just would submit that unless we have fundamental tax reform and unless we have fundamental entitlement reform, all of this other agenda, which is exactly right, is going to have very, very grave difficulties in being implemented. So, any comments?
So I would just say that for one quick thing, for our guests, Belle and her colleagues at Brookings have done some terrific work in a series that's small books called Restoring Fiscal Sanity. Is that the phrase? Which I'd really, if you're interested in these issues, I think it's the single best place to go to kind of understand the issues. And we should have mentioned it earlier.
So for closing comments, what I'd like to do is, what is the one sentence that you would try to capture this discussion, particularly competitiveness, that you would want people to leave thinking about, knowing about? Is there one sentence that, it's not a bumper sticker, it's a sentence, that you would have somebody take home and pass to their spouse or their college-age kid or their roommate?
We can start that answer.
We'll start at this end. Dana, you're on the spot first.
Well, my sentence is going to follow the pattern of Senator Joseph Biden with
You're going to steal it from
35 conjunctions. I would simply say that we have got a nation now that appears to have embraced what I would call a transactional form of political discourse and political activity. It's a flat, not in the sense that Friedman meant it, but it's a flat conversation in Washington where one activity is done in exchange for another one. It's not vision-driven, it's not outcome-driven. And it happens that way because the population appears to want it to happen that way. We play into the trap of transactional politics, whether when we're at the local chamber level, at the environmental level, when we demand earmarks for our own special projects without regard for the big picture. And I think what we really need is leadership and vision. And that, to me, is the setting in which competitiveness can really take place and flourish.
I'll do one sentence about the way Dana did one sentence. The Biden model, someone made a comment about the jobs aren't coming home, and we ought to be confident in our own edge in innovation. I think that's the answer. In looking at China, it's exactly right. China, yeah, they're training about, 10 times as many engineers as we are, but our 10% of engineers are an awful lot better than their 100%. Our engineers learn to innovate and to think creatively, and their engineers learn to copy. Our engineers were better when we didn't have this visa wall, and we were bringing Asians into our schools, and many of them stayed here and became part of our innovative structure. We ought to get away from the fearfulness that has come in the last few years and go back to relying upon our strengths, which is our openness and our innovation.
I've got a sentence which can also be a bumper sticker. We are a metro nation, and it's high time to start acting like one. So when you think about what it's going to take for this country to be globally competitive, to deal with our social divide, to deal with the sustainable issues, it's going to really depend on the health and vitality of a relatively small number of places in the United States, because that's where our assets are concentrated, and that's where the challenges, for the most part, appear. And I do think, getting to Belle's comment, we have to be very realistic about the ability for large new investments, whether it's with regard to infrastructure or housing or other aspects of domestic life. But here is where I think in the 21st century, we could have a very different kind of relationship between the national government and ultimately these metro engines of national prosperity. And I would hope, irrespective of who gets elected, that we get to a point where the national government can literally challenge metropolitan areas. How are you going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? How are you going to at least slow the rise in congestion? How are you going to improve and reduce the racial disparities on education and skills? And as metros begin to invent, because they are the inventive agents, the national government begins to lower the silos, reduce the barriers, get out of the way, and allow for a much more entrepreneurial public-private partnership to take place in this country. So my view of the world, Metro Policy Program, not surprising, the world sort of starts from the bottom up. But I think that can inform a very different way forward and a very different way of acting that actually can deal with some of the big fiscal challenges we have.
And that was one sentence?
Well, I started with one sentence.
The way I think about it is when you're running a big complex organization, or you're dealing with a set of big complex problems, it helps to have a North Star or two that you use as a way to get perspective on what you're trying to accomplish and try to guide yourself that way. And the way I think about this issue is it distills down to two very broad things. One is we need to restore the American dream. We need to, by which I mean create the means and the opportunity for every American to be successful. I'll be thinking hard about how we do that. And we ought to fulfill the generational promise, which is what I think you were talking about, which is to leave this country and this planet better off for our children than we got it from our parents. And I think we have largely over the last 10 or 15 years failed very meaningfully on both of those tests, and we ought to get back to having that guide, kind of how we think about what we do.
That's great. Well, with that, I really want to thank our panelists. I want to thank our terrific audience for the questions and all for being here this morning. Our partners in putting this event together, and enjoy the rest of the day. The Brookings folks, we still have one or two small things left. They're mostly fun lunch discussion, and then we're all gathering together this evening for an oyster roast. So,
and I snuck in behind Bill to say the thank you as well to our partners, the Charleston Post and Courier, the College of Charleston, SCETV, the Thorntons for their hospitality, all of you in Charleston. We've really enjoyed the opportunity to interact. Fred Malik and Glenn Hutchins and others from our advisory council. We're going to, as we stream out, and before we say thank you to this panel, we're going, just to let you know, show a little video that summarizes some of what we've been doing with this project. But I'm sure all of my co-conspirators at Brookings would agree that there's been no greater pleasure and no better conversation than we've been able to have with you here today. So thank you, thanks to the panel, and a good day.